In the still darkness before dawn on October 2, 1187, Sultan Saladin stood on a hill overlooking the horns of Hattin. The decisive battle had been won months earlier, and now Jerusalem, Christianity's holiest city in the Levant, lay within his grasp. As his advisors discussed the coming siege, Saladin remained silent, contemplating not the glory of conquest but the consequences of his next decisions. Unlike many commanders who came before him, Saladin understood that true victory extended far beyond the battlefield. The fundamental difference between great commanders and ordinary military leaders has never been about battlefield brilliance alone. History's most successful commanders, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte, from Cyrus the Great to Tokugawa Ieyasu, comprehended deeper truths about human nature, strategic patience, and the complex interplay between military might and political wisdom. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE with his single legion, he was not merely initiating a civil war, he was executing the culmination of years of political maneuvering and psychological preparation. His famous declaration Alia iacta ist, the die is cast, represented his understanding that timing, perception, and momentum often matter more than numerical advantage. Indeed, Caesar knew what most did not, that Rome's legionaries would hesitate to fight their celebrated commander, and that hesitation would multiply his effective strength tenfold. The greatest commanders throughout history shared several critical insights that separated them from their contemporaries and continue to distinguish exceptional leaders today. Consider Alexander the Great, who in 334 BCE began his eastern campaign against the Persian Empire with forces significantly smaller than those commanded by King Darius III. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander faced a Persian army potentially twice the size of his approximately 40,000 men. The conventional wisdom would suggest a defensive posture or retreat. However, Alexander understood what many commanders fail to grasp: terrain can neutralize numerical advantage, and the psychology of leadership can transcend mathematical odds. Alexander personally led the decisive cavalry charge that broke the Persian line, deliberately targeting Darius himself. This was not mere bravado but calculated psychological warfare. Alexander understood that Persian military culture centered around their king. When Darius fled the battlefield, the Persian army collapsed despite maintaining significant numerical superiority. The mind of the commander is everything, wrote the Roman historian Vegetius in his military treatise De Re Militari around 390 CE. Great commanders throughout history have embodied this principle, recognizing that armies are not simply collections of weapons and men, but complex social organisms responsive to morale, perception, and belief. William Moltke, studying these historical patterns at Prussia's War Academy in 1858, observed that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. His statement reflected not pessimism but a profound understanding shared by history's greatest commanders, that adaptability trumps rigid planning. This principle was masterfully demonstrated by Hannibal Barca at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. Facing a Roman army of approximately 86,000 men with his force of around 50,000, Hannibal employed a tactical innovation that military academies still study today. Rather than forming the traditional solid line, Hannibal crafted a formation that appeared weak in the center. When the Romans pushed forward, believing they were breaking Hannibal's line, his forces enveloped them from both sides, resulting in the annihilation of the Roman army. What made Hannibal exceptional was not merely his tactical brilliance but his psychological insight. He understood the Roman tendency toward direct confrontation and manipulated their cultural predispositions to his advantage. Moreover, he recognized that his own troops, a diverse collection of Carthaginians, Numidians, Gauls, and Iberians, required victories to maintain their coalition. Each decision Hannibal made considered both the immediate tactical situation and its broader implications. The connection between battlefield command and political acumen represents another critical insight mastered by history's greatest commanders. Few embodied this better than Genghis Khan, who between 1206 and 1227 CE created the largest contiguous land empire in history. While popular imagination often reduces Genghis to a brutal conqueror, his true genius lay in governance innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. After conquering a region, Genghis Khan instituted a meritocratic system that incorporated talented individuals regardless of ethnic origin or previous allegiance. He established a sophisticated relay communication network called the YAM system that enabled messages to travel nearly 250 miles per day across the empire. Most importantly, he implemented religious tolerance throughout his domains during an era when such concepts were virtually unknown in Europe or the Middle East. These governance innovations were not separate from his military strategy but integral to it. Genghis understood that conquest without effective administration was temporary at best. His Mongol commanders were not merely skilled at warfare but trained to establish governance systems that could endure. This comprehensive approach to command, integrating military, political, and administrative dimensions, characterizes history's most successful leaders. The Byzantine general Belisarius demonstrated similar insights during Emperor Justinian's campaigns to reconquer the Western Roman Empire in the 6th century CE. With limited resources and operating far from Constantinople, Belisarius recognized that military victory alone would be insufficient. His campaigns from 533 to 540 CE to recapture North Africa and Italy succeeded not merely through tactical brilliance but through his political integration of local populations and former enemies. After defeating the Vandals in North Africa in 534 CE, Belisarius did not institute a reign of terror but incorporated many former enemies into his administration and military. When he later conquered Rome in 536 CE from the Ostrogoths with a force of merely 5,000 men, he succeeded because local populations saw Byzantine rule as potentially beneficial rather than merely exchanging one conqueror for another. These historical examples illustrate a fundamental truth: great commanders comprehend the moral dimension of conflict. Unlike ordinary military leaders who focus solely on destroying enemy forces, history's greatest commanders understood that wars are ultimately won by breaking the enemy's will to resist and establishing conditions for sustainable peace. No commander better exemplified this understanding than the aforementioned Saladin. When he recaptured Jerusalem in 1187 CE after 88 years of Christian control, he prohibited massacre and pillage, allowing Christian residents to depart with their possessions after paying a ransom. Those unable to pay were often released anyway. This conduct stands in stark contrast to the Christian capture of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade, when Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Saladin's clemency was not merely moral virtue but strategic calculation. By demonstrating mercy, he undermined European propaganda about Muslim barbarity and complicated efforts to launch new crusades against him. His understanding of the broader political context of his military campaigns placed him among history's truly great commanders. In more recent history, Admiral Horatio Nelson demonstrated another quality shared by great commanders: the ability to develop innovative approaches when conventional methods prove insufficient. During the Napoleonic Wars, naval combat typically involved ships firing in line formation. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Nelson divided his 27 ships into two divisions that cut perpendicular to the Franco-Spanish line of 33 vessels, a radical departure from established doctrine. Nelson's approach carried significant risks, as his leading ships would be vulnerable before the remainder of his fleet could engage. However, he understood both the technical advantages, the superior rate of fire of British ships, and the human element, the exceptional training of British crews, that would allow this tactic to succeed. Beyond the tactical innovation, Nelson had cultivated a command culture that empowered subordinate captains to exercise initiative, what he called the Nelson touch. This cultivation of organizational culture represents another insight mastered by truly great commanders. Rather than demanding blind obedience, they develop systems that multiply their effectiveness through the empowered judgment of subordinates. Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke institutionalized this approach in the Prussian, later German, army with the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, beginning in the 1860s. This command philosophy provided subordinates with objectives but granted them latitude in execution methods. The result was an organization capable of adapting to rapidly changing circumstances without awaiting orders from higher headquarters. Moltke's innovations demonstrated remarkable foresight regarding modern warfare's complexity. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, Prussian forces consistently outmaneuvered their French counterparts despite the latter's technological advantages in weapons like the Chassepot rifle. The decisive factor was not equipment but organizational adaptability. Prussian commanders could make decisions rapidly while French units awaited specific instructions from higher echelons. The ability to perceive longer strategic timelines distinguishes history's greatest commanders from merely competent military leaders. When Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged victorious at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, unifying Japan after decades of civil war, he did not execute the families of his defeated enemies as was customary. Instead, he incorporated many former opponents into his governance structure while keeping their heirs as political hostages in Edo, modern Tokyo. This approach established the Tokugawa shogunate that would govern Japan for over 250 years. Ieyasu understood that immediate vengeance might satisfy short-term desires but would generate new cycles of violence. His perspective extended beyond his lifetime to the creation of sustainable institutions, a hallmark of truly exceptional leadership. Throughout history, the most successful commanders shared another critical insight: logistics often matter more than tactics. When Alexander the Great campaigned in Asia, he devoted extraordinary attention to supply lines and provisioning. Before crossing into Persia, he established coastal bases to support his advance and maintained fleet coordination with his land forces to ensure continuous resupply. This logistical emphasis allowed Alexander to sustain operations thousands of miles from his homeland for over a decade. By contrast, commanders who neglected logistics often saw initial victories transform into catastrophic defeats. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812 with approximately 685,000 men, his inadequate preparation for supplying such a massive force in hostile territory resulted in the virtual destruction of his Grande Army. By the campaign's end, fewer than 120,000 soldiers survived to return westward. Napoleon's failure in Russia illustrates another insight mastered by truly great commanders: the necessity of accurately assessing one's own capabilities and limitations. During his earlier campaigns, Napoleon demonstrated this capacity admirably. At the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, facing combined Austrian and Russian forces, Napoleon deliberately created the impression that his army was weaker than it actually was, enticing his opponents into a trap. Napoleon recognized that the Allied commanders, Emperor Francis II of Austria and Tsar Alexander I of Russia, were eager for glory and would interpret his apparent weakness as an opportunity. By contrast, in 1812, Napoleon failed to accurately assess the limitations of his logistical system and the determination of Russian resistance, errors that great commanders typically avoid. The capacity to understand and manipulate enemy perceptions represents another characteristic shared by history's most successful commanders. During China's Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 CE, the military strategist Yuge Liang found himself defending a city with a token force against a much larger army. Rather than attempting a hopeless defense, Yuge ordered the city gates opened, swept the streets, and sat playing a lute atop the city wall as enemy forces approached. The opposing general, suspicious of such unusual behavior and respecting Yuge's reputation for cunning, assumed the empty city was a trap and withdrew his forces. This episode, known as the empty fort strategy, demonstrates how great commanders leverage psychological factors beyond mere force calculations. Perhaps the most profound insight shared by history's greatest commanders is the understanding that war is ultimately subordinate to political objectives. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously articulated this principle in his treatise on war, published posthumously in 1832, stating that war is a continuation of politics by other means. Great commanders throughout history instinctively understood this relationship between military action and political purpose. When Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, ending the Second Punic War, he did not demand Carthage's destruction. Instead, he imposed terms that neutralized Carthage as a military threat while allowing it to continue as a commercial power, paying indemnities to Rome. This settlement served Rome's political interests more effectively than complete annihilation would have, as it provided economic benefits without the costs of directly administering new territory. By contrast, after the Third Punic War ended in 146 BCE, Rome completely destroyed Carthage, a decision driven more by ideology than strategic necessity. This destruction required Rome to invest resources in directly governing North Africa rather than receiving tribute from a client state. Thomas Kearney, professor of military history at West Point from 1978 to 1992, noted that the greatest commanders in history understood that their ultimate objective was not to destroy enemies but to create conditions for sustainable peace advantageous to their own side. This principle remains as relevant in modern conflicts as it was in ancient ones. The relevance of these historical insights extends far beyond military affairs. In business, politics, and organizational leadership, the same principles that distinguished history's greatest commanders from their contemporaries continue to separate exceptional leaders from the merely adequate. In corporate settings, leaders who understand the importance of organizational culture, the moral dimension of leadership, and the relationship between short-term actions and long-term objectives consistently outperform those focused solely on immediate results. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he did not merely introduce new products but transformed the company's entire culture and strategic orientation, a comprehensive approach reminiscent of history's great commanders. In international diplomacy, leaders who appreciate the interplay between power projection and political accommodation achieve more durable outcomes than those relying on coercion alone. The Marshall Plan, implemented after World War II to rebuild Western Europe, represented this sophisticated understanding that economic development and political stability would serve American interests more effectively than punitive measures against former enemies. Even in non-hierarchical organizations, the insights mastered by great commanders remain relevant. When Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales established governance systems for the online encyclopedia, he created structures that empowered individual contributors while maintaining quality standards, an approach conceptually similar to Moltke's Auftragstaktik, allowing distributed decision-making within a coherent framework. What made commanders like Alexander, Hannibal, Saladin, Napoleon, and others truly exceptional was not merely their tactical brilliance but their comprehensive understanding of human psychology, organizational dynamics, and the complex relationship between military means and political ends. They recognized that armies are not machines but human systems responsive to morale, perception, and belief. They understood that sustainable victory requires more than battlefield success, it demands political acumen, administrative competence, and moral legitimacy. As we navigate the complexity of modern leadership challenges, the insights mastered by history's greatest commanders offer valuable guidance. The technological context may change, but the fundamental principles of human motivation, organizational effectiveness, and strategic thinking remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. The commander who stood before Jerusalem in 1187 understood what many leaders throughout history have failed to grasp, that how one wins matters as much as the victory itself. Saladin's mercy toward Jerusalem's inhabitants did not merely reflect personal virtue, it represented strategic wisdom that transformed military success into lasting political achievement. In this comprehensive understanding of leadership's multiple dimensions lies the essential difference between history's truly great commanders and those who merely held command.